Good afternoon. Today I'm going to wish you all a Merry Christmas by reading a very appropriate letter of Dr. Jung, which came to me by Synchronicity this morning. I've been reading the 14 letters contained in Edward Edinger's book, The New God Image, all through the past year. But I had held aside one letter, that to Dr. Erich Neumann, because it was a very short letter, and I thought that it would be not quite so interesting, and it didn't really capture my imagination. But when I read it this morning, I realized that this last letter that I'm reading from this book is by Synchronicity coming to me now, the day before Christmas. And so I think it's very appropriate to read as a Christmas message from Dr. Jung, and addressed to Dr. Neumann, of course, but Dr. Neumann collaborated in bringing it to you, so I'm going to do that now. So I'm reading from The New God Image by Edward Edinger. And this is a letter from to Dr. Erich Neumann, who was living in Israel at the time, from Dr. C.G. Jung. It's dated 10 March 1959, so about 27 months before Dr. Jung's death. And here's what Dr. Jung said. Dear friend, the question, is the Creator conscious of himself, is not a pet idea, but an exceedingly painful experience with well-nigh incalculable consequences, which it is not easy to argue about. For instance, if somebody projects the self, this is an unconscious act, for we know from experience that projection results only from the unconscious. Incarnatio means first and foremost God's birth in Christ. Hence, psychologically, the realization of the self as something new, not present before. The man who was created before that is a creature, albeit made in the likeness of God, and this implies the ideal of the fellatio and the sacrificium divinum. Incarnation is, as you say, a new experience. It has happened almost by accident and casually. This sentence might well characterize the whole process of creation. The archetype is no exception. The initial event was the arrangement of indistinct masses in spherical form. Hence, this primordial archetype, mandala, appears as the first form of amorphic gases, for anything amorphous can manifest itself only in some specific form or order. The concept of order is not identical with the concept of meaning. Even an organic being is, in spite of the meaningful design implicit within it, not necessarily meaningful in the total nexus. For instance, if the world had come to an end at the Oligocene period, it would have had no meaning for man. Without the reflecting consciousness of man, the world is a gigantic, meaningless machine. For in our experience, man is the only creature who is capable of ascertaining any meaning at all. We still have no idea where the constructive factor in biological development is to be found. But we know that warm-bloodedness and and a differentiated brain were necessary for the inception of consciousness, and thus also for the revelation of meaning. It staggers the mind even to begin to imagine the accidents and hazards that, over millions of years, transformed a lemur-like tree dweller into a man. In this chaos of chance, synchronistic phenomena were probably at work, operating both with and against the known laws of nature to produce, in archetypal moments, syntheses which appear to us miraculous. Syntheses which appear to us miraculous. Causality and teleology fail us here because synchronistic phenomena manifest themselves as pure chance. The essential thing about these phenomena is that an objective event coincides meaningfully with a psychic process. That is to say, a physical event and an endo-psychic event have a common meaning. And an endo-psychic event, that is to say, a physical event and an endo-psychic event have a common meaning. This presupposes not only an all-pervading latent meaning which can be recognized by consciousness, but during that pre-conscious time, a psychoid process with which a physical event meaningfully coincides. A psychoid process with which a psychoid process with which a physical event meaningfully coincides. Here the meaning cannot be recognized because there is as yet no consciousness. It is through the archetype that we come closest to this early, irrepresentable psychoid stage of conscious development. Indeed, the archetype itself gives us direct intimations of it. Unconscious synchronicities are, as we know from experience, altogether possible, since in many cases we are unconscious of their happening, or have to have our attention drawn to the coincidence by an outsider. 2. Since the laws of probability give no ground for assuming that higher syntheses, such as the psyche, could arise by chance alone, there is nothing for it but to postulate a latent meaning in order to explain not only the synchronistic phenomena, but also the higher syntheses. Meaningfulness always appears to be unconscious at first, and can therefore only be discovered post hoc. Hence, there is always the danger that meaning will be read into things where actually there is nothing of the sort. Synchronistic experiences serve our turn here. They point to a latent meaning, which is independent of consciousness. Since a creation without the reflecting consciousness of man has no discernible meaning, the hypothesis of a latent meaning endows man with a cosmogonic significance, a true raison d'être, reason for being. Read that sentence once more. Since a creation without the reflecting consciousness of man has no discernible meaning, the hypothesis of a latent meaning endows man with a cosmogonic significance, a true raison d'être. If, on the other hand, the latent meaning is attributed to the Creator as part of a conscious plan of creation, the question arises, why should the Creator stage manage this whole phenomenal world, since he already knows what he can reflect himself in, and why should he reflect himself at all, since he is already conscious of himself? Why should he create, alongside his own omniscience, a second, inferior consciousness, millions of dreary little mirrors, when he knows in advance just what the image they reflect will look like? After thinking all this over, I have come to the conclusion that being made in the likeness applies not only to man, but also to the Creator. He resembles man, or is his likeness, which is to say that he is just as unconscious as man, or even more unconscious, since, according to the myth of the Incarnatio, he actually felt obliged to become man and offer himself to man as a sacrifice. Sincerely yours, C.G. Jung. Okay, so what Dr. Jung is saying in this letter, it seems to me, is that God could only become conscious through man, and that consciousness had to come through the birth of Christ. Let me go back and review a few points that he makes here. So he says, psychologically, the realization of the self as something new. Okay, so what he is saying here is that the self, the God image, is ultimately realized in the birth of Christ, or by the life of Christ. And it was not present before in human existence. So the self, mind you, is the deepest archetype in the unconscious of man. And what he's further saying here is that the incarnation is a new experience. So the incarnation of Christ, of the realization of the self, which Christ is a symbol of, is the new experience. This is why God had to become man. And before this creation, or before the creation of man as a conscious being, there were only amorphous gases in the universe. And he emphasizes that without the reflecting consciousness of man, the world is a gigantic, meaningless machine. And so God had to become conscious, but his point later on here is that why would the Creator, if the Creator were conscious, why would the Creator create all these millions of dreary little mirrors? What was happening was that God was becoming conscious himself through the millions of dreary little mirrors. And let's see. And the process of the consciousness of human beings has come not only by random acts of evolution, but also by unconscious synchronicities. In other words, as he says, synchronicities are objective events coinciding meaningfully with a psychic process. And so sometimes those psychic processes are taking place unconsciously, and they're taking place in what he calls the psychoid stage of conscious development, and therefore they're irrepresentable, meaning they can't be depicted by anyone. So he also postulates here a latent meaning in order. But he warns that there's a danger that meaning will be read into things where actually there is nothing of the sort. He does point to the fact that latent meaning is independent of consciousness. So it's happening at the unconscious level, and it's independent of individual human beings. And the point he's making is that in order for the Creator to become conscious of himself, he himself had to become man, which is why Jesus Christ is presented, is incarnated. And so there's one other thing I wanted to mention here. In his sentences in the letter, he says, "It has happened almost by accident and casually." And the footnote reads, "Natural history tells us of a haphazard and casual transformation of species over hundreds of millions of years of devouring and being devoured." So anyway, okay, so that's the final letter, and I've been reading from The New God Image by Edward Edinger, and it's up to you to figure out how this applies to the birth of Jesus Christ. What Dr. Jung is intimating here is that at the time of Christ, there was a development of a new consciousness in humanity. And what he is later talking about is the fact that we are now developing into even a higher level of consciousness. This is basically covered in Answer to Job, where he is pointing out that it's not only Jesus Christ who had the divine within him, but all of us, all human beings, have the divine in us. Now, of course, that means that there's a risk of inflation where someone gets a God Almighty-like attitude toward the world. I won't mention names here, but the reality is that each one of us, including from all religions, has a spark of divine within us. And so Christ was only the first manifestation of that. But now, at this beginning of this 3rd century post the birth of Christ, humanity may be ready to recognize that spark of divinity within all of us. We can hope so. And so that's my message, and I'm sticking to it. And so thank you for joining me today, Art and Sean, and all the others who are here but are lurking in the background. I wish you all a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. And if you are not Christian, I urge you to at least take a look at the Christian stories, not because I'm proselytizing, but because they can inform you about your own stories and what those stories also mean. So Sean says, Was the Star of Bethlehem being poisonous to the horses symbolism of the shadow or something else? I guess I'm not familiar, Sean, with that part of the story. I think that there's an interesting point that the Buddhists make. My wife, being a Buddhist, talks about the three wise men who came to Christ, and I never understood, why there should be three wise men. But there's a Buddhist idea that these three wise men were searching for a tulku, a Tulku, which is a reincarnation of an earlier teacher or adept. I'll put that word up here. And so if you go watch the movie Kundun, Kundun, you will find in that a depiction of the search for the new Dalai Lama in 1932, I believe. I think the new Dalai Lama was found in 1932. And you can see real parallels between the search for the Dalai Lama in the 20th century and the search for the Christ in the time of the birth of Christ. And so the Buddhist tradition says that the wise men were looking for a tulku, and this would comport with the biblical fact that Christ disappeared from age 12 until age 30, which in our current 14th Dalai Lama's lifetime is very similar to his time of training before he really assumed the mantle of leading the Buddhist world. I mean, he certainly did. He became officially the Dalai Lama, I guess, when he was 18, but he didn't really show his leadership per se, probably until about the time of his escape into India from Tibet. And that is that happened in 1959, so it was when he was 29 years old. Or I think that's right, about 29 years old. So about the same time as Christ became a teacher in the Holy Land. And so we'll never know. We'll never know, of course, but I think it's just a very interesting story that overlaps Christianity with Buddhism. So anyway, for what it's worth, because of the synchronicity of finding that letter this morning and realizing that it's the only letter that I hadn't read in the book, I thought this was a good time to be reading it by Synchronicity. And I'm just amazed that that all the things that came together in such a way so that by synchronicity I should want to read this particular letter on this particular day. It's very interesting, synchronicity. Anyway, Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. I hope to see you again once or twice before the new year, but if not, peace on earth and goodwill to men and women.